So, in the winding streets of a very poor district of Cairo, centuries back, women were running hither and thither because another woman was in labour. Great commotion, great excitement, great urgency, which resulted in the birth of a little boy. The mother was exhausted and joyously happy. The other women who'd not actually given birth, they were pleased too. And that mother fell in love with her baby as soon as she smelt him, as soon as she held him, and then she looked at him and said, "Look at his face. It's as if one half of the sun and one half of the moon have met in one face." And the women nearby going, yes, yes, a bit like that. What they thought privately was, poor child, he's very ugly. His face doesn't match with itself. Well, the baby was named Kasim and began his life. Of course, as a baby, he had no idea that he was shaped differently to other babies. But as he began to grow through childhood, infancy, he began to learn. And by the time he was 11 years old, younger, actually 9, he knew very well. He knew, by the way, other children pulled away from him. Other children asked him painful questions. Older children were very cruel to him, even grown-ups. Kasim learnt young that he had a face that people did not like. So he was alone a lot. He walked around the city a great deal. Cairo is, even today, it's an incredibly friendly, very hospitable and generous city. In those days, yeah, he could walk where he wanted, and so he did. And he'd been given a present from an aunt, I think it was, a little simple bone pipe, which he which he played. He played it very well, actually. He was gifted. And because he spent so much time by himself, his pipe was his friend, his best friend. And as he walked around the city, he would play music inspired by different parts of the city. So if he walked through the souk, the market, he would play coffee seller music. He would play butcher shop music. He would play just things that came into his head. And his music would have the rhythm and the flow of people's speech. It was very good. He would walk through the square where the Sultan's soldiers exercised. And he would play music inspired by their drills, by their activities. All over the city he'd go. And he became very well known. There's Kasim. Merchants would call him, "Kasim, sounding good today. How are you? Do you want an apple?" "Kasim, yes, yeah, have one of these. Have one of these. It's lovely. It's pistachio, and yeah, try it." He was popular. In a way. But not amongst his peers. As I said, he would go all sorts of places in the city, but there was one place he would save up for his favourite. By following some really tiny, snaking, twisting alleys that you had to be quite sharp-sighted to even spot. He would come to a point where the alley was between two tall, strong walls. Then there was a breach in the wall on one side from which a large, old fig tree grew, and he would shin up that and clamber into its branches and then over a strong branch onto the top of the wall on the other side where he would sit, hidden by the broad leaves of that fig tree, and he would just wait. Because behind this wall was a garden. It was as if it was a table covered in jewels. That garden was so beautiful. There were flowers of every kind, of the richest fragrance, of the most exquisite colour and shape. And there was his pipe in his hands, silent and waiting. Because not every time, but on lucky occasions, when he waited there, somebody would come into that garden. A little girl, about his age, though very different in every other way. She was rich, you could see from her clothing. She was beautiful. Her face itself was like a jewel. And Kasim would watch as she went from plant to plant. She knew them all by name. She spoke to them all. She kissed some of them. And she was the loveliest flower in that loveliest of gardens. And Kasim would sit in silence. And only when she'd completed her rounds, and only when she'd left the garden, then he'd put his pipe to his lips and he'd play music for her and for the garden. And it was the loveliest music he ever played. Years passed. He learnt who she was. He realized that however he felt about her, it was doomed, it was futile, because she was the Sultan's daughter. She was the Princess Yasmin, the most adored, loved, coveted of all of Cairo, and he was Kasim, the funny boy who walks around playing music on his pipe, the one with the face which doesn't match, the ugly boy. He knew, by the time he was a teenager, by the time he was a young adult, he knew he loved her. But he knew his love was... So he poured it all out through his pipes. And as he grew, the quality of his music changed. The notes had different timbre. The scales he used, even the most joyful, would have threads of sorrow and melancholy. And the music was exquisite. Then one year, who knows why, one year some wild raiders came from out of the depths of the desert, and the Sultan's soldiers had grown fat on decades of peace. And they went out full of pomp and glory, and they were cut to ribbons and sent running. They came scrambling back to the safety of the city walls. Now these raiders had come out of the desert. They had not encountered anything as stout as the walls of the city of Cairo before, and so they couldn't get inside. They had no siege equipment, they had nothing but the weapons they could carry. And so inside, the city dwellers felt a bit smug. Well, the raiders went around destroying the fields that twined either side of the Nile, that implausible green vine that brings so much life to Egypt. Well, the people inside the city thought, well, that's all right. They'll run out of food before we will, and then they'll be off. But that didn't seem to be happening. These raiders seemed to be getting supplies from somewhere. And so the people in the city began to live in greater and greater fear, and every night they could smell the fire from the raiders' camps. Every night they could hear the singing, the chanting, the shouting, the ululating. And they began to grow very, very afraid. The Sultan spoke to his generals. The generals exhorted their troops. The troops said, no way, not doing it, sorry. The troops had no morale. The whole strength that the Sultan believed he'd relied on for years was shown to be a mirage. So the Sultan made a proclamation. He declared that if any man in the city could lead his troops to victory over those raiders, drive them back to the desert, then he would reward that man with the greatest gift he could give to any man. I think you can guess. He would give them the hand of his daughter, the Princess Yasmin, to marry. Well, of course, there were lots of men, young men, old men, middle-aged men, who thought, but then they looked at the task in hand and thought, no, can't do it, sorry. But Kasim heard this. Kasim, as you know, did more listening than talking. Kasim had heard people in the market talking about a holy man, a dervish, who was somewhere in the desert. And this holy man was so exalted that his prayers could perform miracles. And it was said that this holy man had the power to pray. You could go to him and ask for a change in yourself. This holy man could pray, and it would come so. So Kasim snuck out of the city one night. He was going to go looking for that holy man. It wasn't hard for one boy on his own to sneak past those raiders. They took no interest in him at all. He skirted their camp from a distance. He heard their singing. It was good. That would inspire him another time, perhaps, to make some music for raiders' music. He went around the outskirts of their camp and into the deep desert, past the gritty, stony parts of the desert nearest to the city, going further and further out into the great shifting sands. And he travelled, I don't know exactly how long for, and I don't know how far, but everywhere he went, he was just following glimmers of rumour, whispers of hearsay. No, not here, not from this oasis. No, he's not. He's looking and looking and looking for this holy man until eventually he found him. A man with a face wrinkled from smiling. And Kasim told him what he wanted. He wanted to be transformed into a man who could lead the Sultan's soldiers to victory over these desert raiders. And the holy man smiled and said, "My son, are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" "Yes," said Kasim. "Because," said the holy man, "you must understand, if I change you, or rather, if you are changed by my prayers, you can't be changed again. The change will be permanent. There's no way I can change you back to what you are now." And Kasim said, "Are you kidding me? Look at me. Why would I want to go back to this?" And so the holy man began to pray and to chant and to pray and to chant and to pray and to pray and to pray. And Kasim tried to stay awake, but found something tugging at his eyelids until he slept. And when he woke, the night had passed, it was morning. And the holy man was smiling even more. He said, "Look, God has been generous." And using a metal dish, he showed Kasim a face that Kasim had never seen before, an even face with high cheekbones, with a strong nose, with a firm chin, well-shaped lips, piercing eyes. And the physique was different as well. And the holy man said, Look at the generosity of the universe." And there was a suit of armour, shining black armour, a scimitar as sharp as the edge of the moon, the crescent moon, and a horse. Kasim was helped into this new kit. He tested the sword in his hand, and it felt like it had always been there. It felt like the most natural thing. He climbed on the horse. He'd never ridden on a horse before, but somehow he knew exactly how to do it. He had been transformed. Well, obviously now, looking like this, he had to be a bit more careful going around that raiders' camp, because they'd have noticed him, right? So he waited for night, and he took very circuitous and very roundabout routes, but he got back into the city of Cairo. And as soon as he entered, people were like, "Who is that?" And men said, "Whoever that is, I think I could follow that man." And women were saying, "Whoever that is, yes, he inspires confidence in me too." Well, he went straight to the palace, climbed the great broad staircase that led into the palace, and was admitted into the presence of the Sultan in his audience chamber. He said, "Majesty, I believe I can lead your men to victory." And the Sultan, looking at him, said, "I believe you can too." So Kasim went to the soldiers, spoke to them, exhorted them, inspired them, asking them, "Are you men? Are you husbands? Are you fathers? Are you going to protect your wives, your children? Or are you going to run? We are not going to wait in this cage of a city for them to attack us. No, we are going to take the fight to them. We are the soldiers of the Sultan. We are citizens of this great city, and we will be victorious." There's a great cry went up from the soldiers as they felt all their courage return to them. Such a cry that it was heard by the raiders outside, who began to reach for their weapons, thinking, "Aye, aye, here comes a bust-up." And led by the soldier in the black armour on the black horse, with the sharp crescent moon scimitar, the soldiers of the Sultan came pouring out of that city like a jet of smoke. So fast they attacked. There was such a battle. People watched it from the ramparts of the city. People could hear it from everywhere in the city, the cries, the screams. Oh, The sands of the desert drank deep of men's blood. And the raiders were routed. What remained of them, tattered, torn, went racing back to the desert, swearing never to come back to those fertile lands around the Nile again, never to attack or threaten that city again. Kasim led his men victorious back into the city, and there were great shouts and cheers, and women were flinging armfuls of jasmine blossom, of rose petals, and they were holding out babies for him to kiss, and he rode at the head of his soldiers into the square outside the Sultan's palace, where the soldiers waited. Kasim dismounted, walked up those great broad steps into the palace, and there was the Sultan, and next to him his daughter, the Princess Yasmin. And the Sultan said, "You have kept your word. You have saved the city. I will keep mine." He turned to his daughter and said, "Yasmin, swear to me you will go to this man. You will take his hand. You will marry him, and you will love him." And Yasmin said, "I can't." "What?" "Father, I can't." "What do you mean?" He said, "No, Father, I can in part obey." "I don't understand. What is this?" "Father, you've told me to go to this man. I will. Take his hand. I will. Marry him. I will. But you've ordered me to do something I cannot do. I can't love him." "Why not?" "I love someone else." "Daughter, are you indiscreet?" "No, they don't even know. They don't even know I know they're there." And she told her father that since she was a little child, she would go into the garden, and then when she left, she'd hear music, the most beautiful music she'd ever heard, which touched her soul. And she learnt where that music came from. He didn't think I could see him, hiding under the leaves of the fig tree. And I could. I saw his face. Such a face. As if one half of the sun and one half of the moon have met in one face. Father, I've loved him all my life. He's the only person I can love. Kasim stepped forward and asked her, did she still love this young man? She did. Did she still have hope that one day he would return? She said she'd not seen him for some time now and was worried. But yes, she had hope that she would see him again. And Kasim said, "Then I will not make you marry me. Because I've had hope, and now my hope is dead. And I will not inflict that pain on you." He turned his back. He left the palace. His men outside were waiting for the celebrations to start, but they saw his face. He walked towards them, not seeing them. They parted. He walked straight through them as if they weren't there. People froze with handfuls of blossom, which went unthrown as they watched this black-clad warrior leave the city without a glance. He walked past the fields around the river, out into the desert, into the deepest, most desolate, distant parts of the desert. And he never came back. It's hard to find because the sands shift, but I've been told that somewhere in the sands of the deepest desert, there is a grave. A simple wooden headstone. Wooden headstone, you get my point. There's no name. Only carved into the wood is the image of a wooden pipe. That's where Kasim sleeps.